welcome. Glad to see everybody here today. This is our 9 May update for OASIS Plus. We are still operating without a final solicitation, and we'll cover the reason why in a few minutes here. So today, some things we're going to cover, just the administrative updates with regards to the Information Hub and Trident support, some opportunity updates. Our weekly topic is going to be all about Polaris, actually. And then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So if there's anything you guys want to ask about, I'll stop the recording actually for that section. So if you've got company-specific or project-specific questions, that won't go on record. That'll just be within the group here, but happy to address those. So moving right along, I am Rebecca Wayland. I'm the GWAC lead. I've met with most of you before, but in case you haven't seen me, nice to meet you. I'm the one kind of orchestrating the efforts on behalf of Trident and staying plugged into the industry updates and kind of guiding the support that we provide. Haven't seen any issues from people, haven't seen any technical issues or no tech bulletins to put out right for the users. I will say the calendar on the Information Hub is really just in flux right now as we wait. So that one is the calendar that's on the portal. You can use it as a rough guideline for the spacing of the major events in the calendar, but I have not updated that yet because we're just not sure when this final solicitation is going to come out. So we can talk about that more in a little bit here. Okay, so for the opportunity updates, we thought we were going to get something by the end of April, right? Because that's what GSA promised. And then on May 1st, they said, well, we're going to give you an update on timing in the coming weeks, which is not the same thing as a final solicitation. That's right about the time all of the Polaris churn erupted. And if you're not tracking, again, we're going to talk about Polaris here in a minute, but that's another GWAC that GSA is on the hook for administering. And in an interview based on a court ruling about that, Tiffany Hickson, who's kind of been our source, right, and the barometer rather, who's been putting out some information from GSA's side on the 4th, she said, hey, we're still optimistic about getting a final solicitation for OASIS Plus out in the next 30 days, but that's still kind of TBD. So one thing that hasn't changed is that we are still anticipating having 90 days to respond to the solicitation once it is released. So this could be a June, July, August proposal. If they don't get it out till later in June, we could see, July, August, September being the real heavy months. But the spacing of the events, we don't expect to change, right? So the plan is still the same, that the first week is going to be dedicated towards reviewing changes, making sure that no projects have become ineligible, that your lineup still works, that there's no new projects that should be considered, confirming points of contact, getting forms prepped, waiting a beat, right? And maybe a week or so just to make sure that there's no immediate corrections or amendments that GSA issues, because that tends to happen with these really big, high pressure solicitations, is that there'll be something that gets overlooked that needs to get corrected. And once we know that things are unlikely to change, then we move forward with the actual distribution of forms. We start letting things, percolate. We start letting the clients sign and validate while we're running some of the information in the background. So hopefully, if there's a silver lining in here at all, there are still some preparatory actions that are constructive that you can be doing while we wait for this final solicitation. So we will make sure to recap those in the next couple days. Or sorry, in the next few slides, not in the next couple days. So I just want to dive in straight away to Polaris and why it matters and why it's driving changes to OASIS Plus. So as I mentioned, Polaris is another GWAC that GSA is administering. It's a small business IT services contract. This is one of the reasons you don't see IT services or IT NICS codes as a primary domain on OASIS Plus, right? There's a totally separate channel for this. Polaris was intended to replace Alliant 2 Small Business, which, if you've been around the block, this is a program that actually got canceled. It had so many protests and so many problems that GSA ended up scrapping it. And so the result is that it's been about 8 years since GSA had an IT services small business vehicle in place. And that's problematic for some obvious reasons, right? Alliant 3 for large businesses is supposed to be coming out in the next year or so. Alliant 2 is in place, but that's not taking care of the small businesses. So really the only kind of writ large vehicles that exist. NASA Soup has some IT components to it. The GSA, mass schedule has IT elements if you're in the right SINs. But there's kind of been this gap that Polaris was designed to fill. Well, because the program had the history that it did, and because it had the importance that it does, there were a lot of eyes on this. It was another scorecard evaluation that was really heavily centered on relevant experience. One of the biggest divergences between Polaris and OASIS Plus is that on Polaris, only the highest scoring proposals were going to receive an award. So there were 4 different pools, and depending on the pool, that kind of dictated the number of awardees that they anticipated having. But it was less than 100, or 100 or less in all cases was kind of the published amount, right? So if you were in the small business track and they thought there were going to be 100 awardees, that was going to be the 100 highest scoring proposals. And if there was a tie for 100th place, they would take anybody with that equivalent score. But it did not have the same minimum point threshold that we're seeing with OASIS Plus. So this is one of the great things about OASIS Plus, hopefully, right, is that you'll know ahead of time if you're qualified to bid or not. With Polaris, because you were getting graded against other bidders, it was really kind of a shot in the dark. You knew your score had to be good, but nobody knows what a winning score is. So that has caused some churn along the way. But one of the reasons that these protests matter is because a certification or the way a project gets counted can really drive changes to who's eligible and what your total score is. So under Polaris, all of the bidders had to have been considered a small business in 541512, because again, this is the IT services vehicle of choice. There was not a cost price evaluation section. It did permit teaming, joint ventures, and mentor-protege relationships. And they used the same project grading criteria for mentor and protege projects. And so the text that you see in red is actually, there were 3 things protested. These 2 elements are what the courts agreed with the protesters on. They said, yeah, wait a second. You haven't applied the interpretation of the law correctly when it comes to not needing to do a cost and price evaluation at the IDIQ level. And also, you can't use the same criteria to grade a protege's projects that you're using for the mentor. You can consider these separately. You can say a mentor has to contribute or cannot contribute more than X number of projects, and a certain number have to come from the protege, but you can't treat those projects as equal and use the same criteria for both. So these are 2 elements that GSA has been directed to change by virtue of this court order ruling the way that it did. And that has some obvious implications for OASIS Plus, right? Because right now, there's not a cost and price evaluation section on OASIS Plus. We think that's going to change, or they're going to have to change the language around the type of task orders that they're going to issue under OASIS Plus. And then same thing with the mentor and protege projects. Mentor-protege relationships are permitted under OASIS Plus, in certain circumstances. And so the fact that you can't grade each of those using the same criteria is probably going to drive some changes to the scorecard. So we can dive in a little bit more on these specific things. And this is not a summary I wrote. This is something that I found by a contract specialist a legal specialist on LinkedIn. And I just thought it did a really good job summarizing what the issue was and what the resolution is. So this is what we talked about with the experience evaluation for the protege. You can't use the same criteria to grade both types of experience. And this makes somewhat sense, right? If you've got a small business who's part of a mentor protege program, the large business is propping them up, but they're just not going to be able to compete on the same scale with the large businesses. So what we didn't want to see was mentor proteges coming in and blowing everybody else out of the water because they've just teamed with all the large businesses. And that was a concern with Polaris from the start. So when it comes to what GSA needs to do to amend and update the solicitation, unfortunately, this opens up a whole can of worms. So just like with OASIS Plus, contract value was one of the largest scoring areas, right? The scale of the project was really important and kind of fundamental to the scorecard evaluation. Relevance for sure, but scale as well was an area to pick up a lot of points. And especially with the way that the Polaris scorecard was weighted, the best things you could do was have coverage across all 5 of the designated Polaris NICS codes, the IT service NICS codes, and then have projects that were really large. That was just the most efficient way to gain points on that scorecard. So if they change and they open the solicitation back up, that kind of throws into question, okay, well, what are they going to do about projects? What's the period of performance that we're going to use now? What's the cutoff date? What's it going to be for recency? And just like with OASIS Plus, you got credit if the project was complete for the funds that were obligated. And if the project was ongoing, you got credit for the whole project ceiling. So if we are now dealing with different dates, a lot of projects could be changing order in the lineup, right, with regards to what they're scoring, just based on what GSA decides to permit. The other thing that they're going to have to answer the question of is, are they going to allow new bids on this? Because there may be businesses who have graduated in status, but were small at the time of the initial submission. There may be businesses who didn't have the right runtime on their projects, but now do because a year has elapsed. And so they're going to have to kind of dig out of this hole and figure out what they're going to do about that. And while the specific question of, what's going to happen with Polaris and how are they going to grade these projects isn't really the concern for this audience, we are watching what scorecard changes happen, right? Because mentor proteges are a relationship permitted under OASIS Plus. So we're going to see if, how they evaluate, if they're going to either raise the bar for the mentor projects, right? If they're going to say, well, you're a large business, so really you shouldn't have the same low threshold as these small businesses, or if they're going to go the other direction and say, no, we are going to lower the bar a little bit, or we're going to have an adjusted scorecard for the protege projects that makes it more realistic to what would be in line with what their capabilities and experience levels are. So we would just expect a little bit of consistency between Polaris and OASIS Plus when it comes to dealing with this problem. Yeah. So we'll see. I don't know. The other issue that GSA is going to have to contend with here is the thing that's good about OASIS Plus is that we're not dealing with a final solicitation and no proposals have been submitted. With Polaris, because we're past the submission date, everything's been closed. They can't just update the evaluation criteria and not give bidders a chance to adjust accordingly. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, they should just implement a minimum threshold, or, hey, they already know how the bid scored. Can't they just use that as justification to make an adjustment? Nope, it's not. That would be grounds for an additional protest. And at that point, really, maybe they should just set the whole thing on fire and make a new one. I don't know. I will say there is a risk that if you were a Polaris bidder, if you're one of the small businesses that also does IT services, it's not outside the realm of the possible that OASIS Plus and Polaris could be live again at the same time. So that's a bridge we'll cross if it comes up, but just planting that seed, not that I'm sure you're not already aware. Okay, the cost price evaluation, this is probably where we are likely to see a more straightforward change. In the case of Polaris, what we had to do on that bid, we did actually have to submit labor ranges for different LCATs, but it wasn't, GSA did not provide what they considered to be their baseline labor rates. So GSA is probably going to have to do some work on the Polaris side and the OASIS Plus side, because if they decided that they wanted to include a cost model, it would probably look very similar to what they did on the original OASIS program. And we have those solicitation docs if you're curious to see them. It's a pretty straightforward price model. They listed all the labor categories and all the ranges that they wanted to see rates for on the contractor site and a government site. So it's a little bit of an onerous task. I'm not going to call it simple, but it is straightforward in terms of the information being requested, especially because GSA on the last iteration of OASIS did provide rate ranges that they deemed reasonable. And as long as you were bidding within those ranges and you didn't have things that escalated you out of them without a sufficient rationale, you were going to be deemed reasonable. So it's not a competitive price comparison at the IDIQ level. You just have to basically agree that, yes, this is your catalog of services. These are the rates that you would bid. They're within the market survey parameters, and everybody should be happy going forward. So more to follow on this for sure. But this is a likely change that we think is coming just based on the chatter in industry and what they've advertised and what the court order kind of recommended as a resolution. One of the things they could do is change the language of the solicitation to say that time and materials and labor hours task orders would make up a featured or predominant portion of the task orders issued under the contract. I don't know how willing GSA would be to do that, because one of the big features, not a bug, right, of OASIS Plus is that it's supposed to accommodate all contract types and provide max flexibility to the buyers, the government buyers and the customers, so that they can get the services they need in the form that they need from this pool of qualified bidders. So I don't know if they would put that limitation out there. I also don't know what the recourse would be, because you'd have to watch the contract run over a certain period of time, or they'd have to establish a quota for it or something. And I'm just not sure what the appetite is for that change. So because the original OASIS had that cost price volume, it seems reasonable that we could see that pop up again on OASIS Plus, because they've got a model that's been implemented and proven. Maybe not everybody loved it, but it did work. So, success might be our worst enemy in this case. So sorry for the bad news, but stand by to do a cost price section to OASIS Plus. This is just kind of what I was alluding to with what the model looked like on the original OASIS. It was a spreadsheet. There was a tab for contractor site, a tab for government site, and there were many, many, many more rows than this, but it broke out the labor categories that were of interest, and there was an accompanying document with GSA provided rates. So again, the goal is to bid within those rate ranges, just to show that, yes, you could deliver things realistically. So a lot of conversation about the churn that's happening and what's going on with Polaris and all that stuff. So what does it mean for you all? For anybody on this call, we're going to keep marching forward with the preparation, right? There is still goodness in going through your project documentation and tagging areas that are going to support your relevance, or making sure that your calculations are correct for your minimum average value. Because even if the threshold changes, you still got to know what your average value is, so you know how to score yourself, right? Those things we don't necessarily see changing. What could change is the projects that you're using based on what becomes ineligible because now too much time has passed, or a project goes from ongoing to completed, and the number that you're using to calculate your annual value changes. Or there might be new projects that come into contention because now they've got that 6-month requisite period of performance that can be evaluated. And now it's an eligible project. And depending on the ceiling, or depending on the value, or depending on the customer, or whatever breadth and depth of scope is covered, it might be a higher scoring project than one you previously had in as a placeholder. So the goal would be to keep doing the prep, the professional employee compensation plan, the uncompensated overtime policy. Those are sections that are not likely to be changed based on this recent decision. So there's still goodness in getting those things drafted, and getting really good clarity on what your project lineup is and what your contingencies are in case this stretches out. Because that first draft RFP came out back in November, and so that was the first time we really saw the comprehensive guidance around what defined a project and what the score was going to be. So if you haven't relooked at your project lineup since that first draft RFP, we're at the 6-month mark. We're at the point where if you got awarded something that same month that the OASIS Plus draft originally came out, you might have a new project that you can sub in as being eligible. And as the summer goes on, that's going to be the case as well. So just keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on the projects that might drop off because now they're exiting a 5-year recency window. Keep an eye on the projects that might be up and coming based on now having 6 months of performance. And that's what we can recommend in terms of just focusing effort and staying constructive in your preparation without just spinning your wheels or feeling frustrated about doing things that are ultimately going to need to get redone. Any questions from the group? That kind of concludes my weekly topic, but I know that there was a lot there and it was all me talking. So I'm happy to field any questions. Like I said, I'll turn off the recording at this point.